Hey, everybody. Another Three Geeks podcast conversation. I have John Orlando, Destiny, and our friend Scott Tracy Griffin joining us today. How you doing, Scott?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
Awesome. Scott, you're a writer, actor, and an expert in Edgar Rice Burroughs, if I'm not mistaken. And you've authored a book, Tarzan on Film. So how's that got? What got you into Tarzan? What got you into researching that and that topic in general?
Well, I started reading the works of Edgar Rice Burroughs when I was 9 years old. As a child, I discovered Tarzan. I guess I always sort of knew who he was through that sort of cultural osmosis, seeing bits of the TV show and the films on network TV. So I became a reader and a fan of Tarzan and John Carter of Mars and all of his stuff. And very early on in the reading process, I became very fascinated with Edgar Rice Burroughs, the author, the man. What sort of mind could come up with these stories? So that's sort of been the journey. I moved to Los Angeles right after college and started writing for the film magazines, Cinefantastique, Film Facts, Femme Fatales, those sort of magazines. And one thing just sort of led to another, and Titan Books in the UK chose me to write my first book, Tarzan's Centennial Celebration, which was for the 100-year anniversary of the character in 2012. And Tarzan on Film is the follow-up. So that's sort of my path. Back in the 90s, I was fortunate to go to a big convention called the Hollywood Collectors Show, where a lot of actors and celebrities go to sell autographs and so forth. And so I was able to meet, both through writing for the movie magazines and going to these shows, meet a lot of the people who contributed to these films, the actors and actresses and so forth.
Now, one thing that I know is synonymous when you talk about Tarzan is that he has kind of a knowledge of nature, I guess we'll call it, or whatnot. Are you kind of outdoorsy as well?
Yes. Well, I grew up, my dad was an optometrist by trade, but he raised cattle on the side. So I grew up out a rural existence in the middle of nowhere in Mississippi. And my mom raised exotic fowl like peafowl and bantams and stuff. And we had dogs and cattle and everything. So I grew up, yes, surrounded by animals. And that was a part of the lure, the appeal to Tarzan. My brother had that lunchbox from the 60s TV show, and it had Tarzan squaring off with a gorilla on one side and a lion on the other. And I was always fascinated with exotic animals. And my earliest childhood ambition was to be a zookeeper, just to be around these animals, elephants and so forth. And so the animals and his communion with nature and with animals was definitely a sort of the appeal, yes.
Well, I have another question here, and it's kind of going to deviate a little bit from what we're talking about right now, Scott, just getting to know you. But when you, obviously throughout your life, you've been a fan of Tarzan, have you noticed, or do you have that same feeling that anybody does when they see something like Tarzan presented not the way that you remember it or like it? Does that make sense?
Yes. The thing about Edgar Rice Burroughs was he was a very distinctive writer, one of the best-selling authors of the 20th century. The creation of Tarzan ranks up there with Superman and Mickey Mouse for worldwide global recognition. So you have this huge, and he's been that way since, in the 1920s, these books were being published in Europe and all over the world. They've been published worldwide in 50-something languages, I believe. And he had a very distinctive voice. He very much had a sense of humor and so forth. And it's difficult because there have been glimpses of it, but I don't think any film or television show, and there have been 53 authorized films and 7 TV shows, plus the John Carter movie, I don't think any of them have truly captured his character or the essence of what Burroughs was trying to convey. And it's a bit unsatisfying, but at the same time, I can appreciate the films for what they were. I really enjoy, if a Johnny Weissmuller film is on TV, I'll sit and watch it. I get a kick out of it. It's fun. It's a product of another time. And, but it's fun. I like I enjoy it for its own sake.
Okay.
Now, to play off of that question at least a little bit, is there one that's more accurate or the most accurate in your opinion in terms of the book? If someone was going to sit down and watch something?
Well, if you were looking for movies that sort of track closely to the book, I would say the Son of Tarzan silent film serial is probably the most accurate. Of course, it's a silent film serial, and the version that's available on DVD is not really good. We've seen glimpses of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan. There were glimpses of it. I thought the Disney movie, they did a great job with it. It's sort of a different mythology, but there are elements of Edgar Rice Burroughs. The modern stuff more. Greystoke, the jungle sequences were kind of crafted right after the book. And then, of course, he goes to England, and that has nothing to do with Edgar Rice Burroughs. The Legend of Tarzan with Alexander Skarsgård and Margot Robbie got some things right about the character. And Casper Van Dien was in a very small film called Tarzan and the Lost City back in 1998. I like that. It's a fun B movie. So we've seen elements of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan, the more modern. Gordon Scott did a good job, I think, as Tarzan and Mike Henry. But there was, for 50 years, what happened was the first 8 silent films and serials were based on the books, very loosely, but they were adaptations of the books. When MGM came along, the biggest, grandest studio in Hollywood, and they want to do a big budget adaptation, or not adaptation, but a big budget release of Tarzan, Burroughs signed a deal with him. He said, well, you can have the character's name, you can have the character, but I don't want you to touch my books. Leave the books alone. I'm never satisfied with how my books turn out on screen. And so they really created a whole new mythology with Johnny Weissmuller and Maureen O'Sullivan, and eventually Johnny Sheffield as Boy. And in doing so, it sort of created a competing vision, because the Johnny Weissmuller Tarzan, people know him, or in the past have known him better than the literary Tarzan. And that was the case up until Greystoke. Greystoke was the first movie to really return to the books and say, let's sort of mine Burroughs' original concepts. And like I said, the succeeding movies have done that to some degree. But the books were off limits for, 51 years. So, and that was Burroughs' choice. I don't think he ever saw what a global brand Tarzan would become. But that's sort of how the character got split between the literary Tarzan and the film Tarzan.
That makes sense. In writing your book or books, what's been the hardest part about doing that? Are there certain stories that have been hard to suss out, or like certain films that were hard to like uncover and peel back the onion on, like facts that you kind of uncovered and say, oh, this would be good for the book or not? Or
tight deadlines.
Yeah.
Tight deadlines are my enemy. I had to do both of these books on a pretty short turnaround, and fortunately, we had a verbal agreement before the contract came through. And I had been, as I said, I think it was around 1993 or 94, I met Gordon Scott and Woody Strode, who played the antagonist in some of these films, and started sort of seeking out their stories and interviewing these guys and stuff. So I had a 20 years of research behind me when I went into these books. So, but it still was a challenge to, it's a tremendous amount of material to distill. And the books are written to be very friendly. You have to kind of draw the line between being very user-friendly to people who have only a superficial idea of who Tarzan is, and to be welcoming to those people, while providing enough grist for the hardcore fans who know the character. And my books are coffee table books. They're lavishly illustrated. I think Centennial Celebration has over 400 photos and illustrations, and Tarzan on Film has over 300 photos and illustrations. So, that was the thing, is you have to distill the little bios and the synopses of the films down into something that's very succinct and engaging and reader friendly. So that wasn't the challenge. The challenge was doing it on a quick turnaround.
You talked about, creating your book and writing your book, but you also helped to write some of the comic strips for Tarzan, correct?
I did a Sunday comic strip story. Yes, back in the 90s, Gray Morrow, the artist, was the longtime artist, and the writer retired. And so they were auditioning writers, and I had hoped to get the full-time gig. They actually had a lot of writers who signed up, and so they went through a lot of stories before they finally settled on another writer who wasn't me. Would love to return to that someday. I enjoy that medium. The thing about a Sunday comic strip versus a comic book is it's a very tight format historically, and it's different now. And a lot of people don't realize that now. You can get these one-page installment comic strips on the computer, on the web, but it's a different experience. I mean, remember back in the 1930s, Tarzan was a full page. It was the back page. You know, the LA Times, for example, had 16 pages of full color comics. Tarzan occupied the full page of the back page. It was the premier premium adventure comic strip along with Flash Gordon. And they devoted a lot of time to it. And kids and even adults would wait, you know, on the edge of their seats each week. You had a cliffhanger. You had to resolve the previous week's cliffhanger, have an adventure, and then leave a new cliffhanger for next week. And people had to wait a week to get this adventure. It's not the same now when you scroll through these strips on the computer and you can just click to the next week and the next week and the next week. You know, there's not that element of waiting, and they can be a little repetitive because it's just like a serial film. You have to sort of recap what went before very succinctly. So that's what I liked about the Sunday strip back when it was in the newspapers. Is it's a very specific format, and it's a challenge to hook people in, you know, 6 to 8 panels.
Yeah, I was just gonna mention, you know, the panels I know would probably be a huge challenge for somebody that's used to writing prose, that trying to fit everything into those 8 panels.
Yes, and you know, it takes some planning. Just like any writing venture, you start with an outline each week. What's my plot point? What's my beat going to be? Where do I want him to arrive each week? And then you go back and how do I get him there? And how do I make it exciting? And what other characters do I bring in? So it's just, you know, there's a formula, and you don't want it to come across as formulaic, but you definitely have to, you know, hit beats as a writer. And so that's something that, you know, the majority of my career has been in nonfiction, because I learned very early on there's always a market for good nonfiction. You know, there's always, if you can provide the combination of information and entertainment, that's always going to be valued. You know, if you're just providing entertainment, tastes change, you know, formats change, things change. So the thing about providing information and entertainment is you have to make this giving the people the information entertaining, so they enjoy it, so they don't feel like they're being fed, you know, information. They feel like, oh, I'm discovering, I'm uncovering. You know, you have to give them sort of that fictitious journey, that fictitious hit the beats as if you were writing fiction, but keep your facts straight, you know, and deliver factual material, but do it in a way that you're hitting beats. So in that respect, merging over to fiction from nonfiction is probably a little easier than going from fiction to nonfiction, unless you happen to be, you know, an expert in a topic. And
how did you organize yourself in order to write your book Tarzan on film? Was there kind of a method to the madness? I know some writers like to outline everything, and then some prefer to use other methods. What was your motive, or excuse me, what was your way of doing that, of getting yourself organized?
well, my first book, Tarzan Centennial Celebration, it was 320 pages. It was a bigger, more ambitious book. And I went into it with, you know, you kind of have that mental map of what you want to accomplish here. If I were reading this, you know, and they've always said, if you can't find a book you want, if there's a book you want in the marketplace and it hasn't been written, you should write it, you know. And that was the thing. I remember even back in the early 90s, I was like, there's so much great art, because all the greatest artists, you know, Frazetta, Hal Foster, Joe Kubert, John Buscema, all the greatest artists of the 20th century, pop artists certainly, illustrated Edgar Rice Burroughs. And so my attitude was, why hasn't there been a coffee table book? And what would I do if I were doing this book? And that book was centered on the novels I started, which they began as pulp stories, but then they were released as novels. So about a little over 50%, maybe 60% of the first book is devoted to the novels. And then I get into film, TV, radio, as those other mediums kind of came online. With the film book, it's kind of easy because, as I mentioned, there were, I think, 52 or 53, depending on how you classify a television movie pilot. I think I classified it with the series 50, so 52 films and 7 series. So those are basically each chapter. One thing I wanted to do with my book was keep it digestible. It's a coffee table book, so if you have company or you're bored, you can pick it up and flip anywhere in the book and read a section and get a self-contained bite. You don't have to start from the beginning and go through. It's obviously it's better if you do it that way. You'll get a more rich reading experience, but you can still get a good experience from picking it up and going to your favorite movie or your favorite TV show. You want to read about Ron Ely? You go right to the Ron Ely section. So that was the first part. It was divided up into sections, and then, like I said, it's making those digestible and accessible. And I wanted a poster for each movie, so there's a full bleed page with the poster. I wanted a short synopsis, and then I wanted behind the scenes information. So there's basically sort of a formula you'll see as you go through. I wanted sidebars in addition to the movies. I think one challenge with this book was I was following in 3 footsteps. Gay Besso did a great Tarzan the Movies book back in the 60s. It was black and white, and it ended in 1968. So I had color at my disposal and the newer films and TV series. David Fury did a great book in the 1990s that was a little more maybe not necessarily academic. I don't want to say it was stuffy, but it was a very methodical approach. But it was black and white, and it was a smaller book. It wasn't big, so I had the size dimension going for me. But I wanted to present the material slightly different from those guys and differently than I had presented it in Tarzan the Centennial Celebration. So I had a verbal agreement to do this book 2 years before my contract came through. So I was able to sort of organize my thoughts and, as you said, outline it and get the material. I didn't do the actual writing. When you're writing nonfiction, one thing you have to be careful about if you're approaching, and my publishing has always been trad publishing. I go to a publisher and they publish my material. I have not self-published to date much of anything except my recent magazine. So you have to be careful and present them with your vision in a proposal without actually writing, because they may tell you, we'll emphasize this, or we're not interested in this, or our audience likes this. So you have to be flexible enough to accommodate whatever your publisher tells you the market needs. So you don't want to be too locked in and say, I've written this book and it's ready to go, because unless they love it, you've just shot yourself in the foot. They're going to tell you to rewrite it or redo something. So you want to give them a couple of sample chapters and say, this is what I'm capable of achieving, and here's my outline, and here's what I want to accomplish, and what do you think? What's your feedback? So that's sort of the proposal process, is being open to them saying, because I may know the material, but they know a lot more about what sells. They chose the cover images. I did not dictate, I want this on the cover. They have marketing departments with degrees in marketing who know a lot more about what's going to grab the eye, on the table at Barnes & Noble than I know. I would choose my favorite art or my favorite this or my favorite that. No, you want to choose. And I'm very happy with the choice, by the way. I thought they were very striking covers. I was very pleased with what they came up with. And I would say pleasantly surprised, like, oh yeah, they picked this image, and I can see how this will be an entree into discussions about this book, an entree into sales. So that's a little bit about, sort of the process behind the scenes of certainly getting a nonfiction book to market.
Awesome. I did want to ask you about, I read here that you were kind of a consultant for different TV shows and brought in for different documentaries. What was that like? Do you have any fun memories of crazy questions that someone presented to you? Like, would Tarzan do this? Would Tarzan not do this?
Usually they're pretty fact-based, not too much off the wall stuff.
Sure.
Or if they do ask you an off the wall question, usually it doesn't make it into the final cut. I would say they tend to ask a lot of the same question. With the films, everybody wants to know about the Tarzan yell. How did that come about? They want to know about Johnny Weissmuller. They want to know about Boy and how he came about. They're just, or the pre-code aspects of it. There are just certain things that it seems like a lot of the documentarians ask. And what's interesting is a number of these documentaries started out, well, we're going to do a documentary on Edgar Rice Burroughs and the body of his work, and we want you as a Burroughs guy. And as they get into the marketing and the other elements of the documentary get involved, it's like, well, we want to do Tarzan on film. It always sort of goes back to the Tarzan films because they have the biggest audience. They have the more, people will recognize Johnny Weissmuller and who he is in that loincloth on sight. But if you try to describe the literary Tarzan, people are going to go, wait, what? This guy spoke all these different languages and he was a literate, in the House of Lords. Who was orphaned in Africa. And so, with Johnny Weissmuller, it's just like memes. One image conveys so much. And so that's how the documentaries, they tend to kind of fall back on the film Tarzan because they feel like that's what will sell.
Sure, that makes sense.
And to get back to your question about fun things, generally it's like this. It's sort of a talking head interview. They bring me in and they put me up in a chair or director's thing. And usually they will give me questions beforehand. These are the areas we're going to, so I can read up on it and make sure I'm up to snuff on whatever they want to ask. And but yeah, it's just sitting there being comfortable answering questions for about an hour. It's the actual filming process. I think there have been a couple where we went and we walked through the Los Angeles County Arboretum where some of the Tarzan films were shot. So that's always fun to get out in nature. But it's pretty simple process to shoot these. So nothing, too exciting behind the scenes.
What I think you dipped your toes into acting. What got you into it? I think I see here you were an NCIS. What landed you that role?
I've had a very eclectic career. I'll say that. I played sports, and part of that was inspired both by my father, who was a two-sport athlete in college for a small college, and the exploits of Tarzan. And I know when I got that Gabe Esso book when I was 14 years old, Tarzan movies, and you read the bios about Johnny Weissmuller, Buster Crabbe, Herman Briggs, Glenn Morris. In the books, Tarzan performs all these just outrageous feats of strength and everything. And as a kid, you're kind of like, it's an abstract. Oh, this is great. He's a superlative. But as I was, growing into young adulthood, you start thinking, what would make a Tarzan? He would be a world-class athlete. So the movie Tarzans were a lot of times Olympic champions or gold medalists or whatever. So that sort of got me into athletics, and I love competing against other people and winning and stuff. But there was also an element of athletics that was performance. I liked performing. I got into theater in high school and college and loved doing theater on stage. And, I came out here hoping to both write and bring Edgar Rice Burroughs to the big screen as he conceived his characters. But also I was interested and involved in acting. And there for a short while, I was able to earn my living for 3 or 4 years entirely from acting. It wasn't, a particularly lucrative career. I did some principal work on commercials and print campaigns and stuff, but it was a lot of, background work or stand-in work, to keep your health insurance and your benefits. And so the NCIS, I just got called in, and they told me lay down on the floor and play dead. And they had 3 of us, and it was to see, can you lie there and not blink or whatever? And your look, your physical look, it was a non-speaking role. And so I got there and they took me aside and said, I went in first, and I went in for a day and they took my photo for my badge or whatever. I had to have an ID badge. So that was a day of work just to take a photo for that. And I went in for another day for, I guess, costume fitting because I was in a military dress uniform or whatever. And so I get there for the actual work and they said, well, we're going to put you on a stunt contract. And I was 44 years old working as a stuntman for the first time. And I'm like, okay. And what it wound up being is I'm the dead body of the week. I get discovered. It's called squall. There's a storm at sea, and some of the sailors look out, and there's a dead body on the deck, and they're crashing through the waves, and water's washing over the deck, and this body's about to be washed off, and they have to bring this body in. So the sailors put on their rain suits, slickers, and they get on a rope, and they go out there and they pull my body in. So the reason I learned that I was going to be a stuntman, that I was a neophyte stuntman at age 44, we filmed up on a destroyer that they use as a trainer up in Port Hueneme up north of Los Angeles. And this is a dock ship that they use to train sailors and stuff on. So it was an actual ship, but it was docked. And I was the last scene of the day. It was about 2 a.m. and it was in January, I believe, early February. And it was like 38 degrees in LA that night. And they had me put on a wetsuit underneath my uniform. And they were hitting me with fire hoses, and they had a 600-gallon tank that they would dump across the deck to try and wash my body off the deck. And so the first time they hit me with the 38-degree water, I just reflexively curled up like a bug. I just went into the fetal position. And they said, "You're dead. You can't curl up in the fetal position when the water hits you." So I said, "Okay, I'll be ready for it next time." And so we did 2 or 3. It took a couple of takes for me to be just absolutely, totally lifeless when got hit with the freezing water. And I was sitting shivering on they had a heater and everything. They had me all set up. I was like the last actor that day, and they had the crew and everything. And I was the last shot of the day. And I'm sitting there shivering in front. I was worried that I was going to get pneumonia or something, which is why they bumped me up on the stunt contract. And so the director came out. He's like, "You're doing a great job. Can we put you on a stunt contract?" And I said, "Well, I'm already on a stunt contract." That was the call of the stunt coordinator. I said, "Can I get a credit? Can I get my name in lights?" And he said, "Yes, we'll do that for you. Thank you." So I was able to get a credit. Normally stuntmen don't necessarily get credits, but so that was my big. Other than, like I said, shooting some commercials and print campaigns, that was my biggest acting experience. It was a lot of fun. But that was always kind of a sideline. I was always writing. I've always just been a creative. I love to create. I love to whatever path that takes.
Would you do another TV show or movie? Would you want another role?
In a heartbeat.
You would? In a heartbeat? Okay. Yeah.
I'll find the water. It'd be great.
Yeah. I do. I don't know if you guys have been following Lanterns. This show, it's about the Green Lanterns. It's coming coming out. You will see me in that.
Oh,
I'm under an NDA, so I can't say anything, but it's a non-speaking role. I'm interacting with the principal, so if you watch closely, you'll see me. I believe it's the first episode of Lanterns. If I don't get cut, that's always the concern, is you may hit the casting floor, but we did shoot some scenes with me with the principal. So,
but you're not dead.
I'll be in the first episode of Lanterns. What's that?
But you're not dead and you're dry.
There's an irony to this.
I bet. We'll talk about it later. I don't want you to break any rules.
I'm dry and I'm alive, and I'm pantomiming a conversation with the lead or one of the principals. And again, I seem to have this luck. We filmed. It was like in the low 40s that night in LA. It was an all-night shoot, and so again, I was freezing to death in this shoot. And it was wet. It had rained. Everything was wet. And everything was soaking wet, and so I think it actually rained some off and on during the shoot, but I don't think it rained on my scenes. But it was physically a miserable shoot, but it was fun.
Fun. Growing up in Mississippi, you guys are pretty hot and humid down there, so probably too those 38-degree days also played a little havoc on you because you're not used to it. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah. Well, the thing about living and people say, Los Angeles is a Mediterranean climate, like it's Italy or something. No, Los Angeles is a desert 9 months out of the year. And then we get rain 3 months. And living in a hot, arid desert environment, your blood gets really thin. So you don't endure cold as well. I've lived out here for 36 years. And if I go back to Mississippi in the wintertime, I freeze, So yeah, your body adapts to that sort of climate when you're in it, and it's challenging, but it's fun, and it's nothing everyone else on set isn't enduring, except maybe having water dumped on you. But
did I hear you say you're self-publishing a magazine, or did I mishear that?
Yeah, it's called Reverberate, a magazine of Edgar Rice Burroughs. my books have been coffee table books, and that's what I really love. One thing about, I saw even 12 and a half, well, 13 years since I did the contract. Years ago, when I did my books, I saw sort of the direction publishing is going, that everything's going online, and basically anybody can be a writer now. Anybody can write their great American novel or whatever and upload it to Amazon and sell it. And that doesn't mean they're a good writer. It just means they're in the marketplace. And, consumers have to wade through that marketplace to find the good stuff. And of course, reviews help. So the thing about the coffee table book is it's not just a narrative. It's an artifact. It's an art object, and so you serve two purposes. People can read and get information, but they also like to just look at the pictures. So, it's difficult to place a coffee table book in the marketplace. I hope to do more on Edgar Rice Burroughs. I think there's still more facets and elements of his work to be uncovered. But in the meantime, I decided to do a periodical. We focus on the nonfiction of Edgar Rice, or it's a nonfiction, focusing on the fiction of Edgar Rice Burroughs. I started out, I was going to sort of balance it and do a little bit about film, a little bit about the comic books, and a little bit about the novels. But the last two issues, I just released the third issue, have been primarily focused on his novels. So it's sort of evolved, and that's the feedback I'm getting is of course, our readers tend to be literary-minded folks, so they really love the work of Edgar Rice Burroughs. They're not so much interested in the Tarzan films and stuff. Doesn't mean we won't revisit those some as needed, but I'm getting really positive feedback on the nonfiction articles about Burroughs fiction.
Would you say that writing this book has changed how you personally watch and evaluate the Tarzan films?
One thing, when I was a young writer, one thing that you have to learn to do as an artist is to shut down your inner critic. And that is the thing about your own work, because you're not an objective analyst of your own work. You need a good editor. You need a good publisher. You need people to come in and tell you, this is good, throw this out. And when you're a neophyte writer, when you're first beginning, there's a lot that gets thrown out, or a lot that you're told, you got to rewrite this, you got to redo this, you're overwriting it, you're, whatever. You may think it's a masterpiece, and then you run into the buzzsaw of a really seasoned, accomplished editor, and they're going to mold you into a writer who's successful in the marketplace, if that's what you want to be. Now, if you just want to self-publish your own, fantasy fiction, that's great. Write for yourself. And there's an element of all artists. You have to ultimately do it for yourself. But at the same time, if you want to be commercially successful, you have to keep the market in mind. I'm sorry, can you repeat your question?
It was, has writing this, has it changed the way that you personally watch or evaluate the Tarzan films?
Yes. I'm sorry. If my answers are too long, let me know.
No, that's
but what
fine.
I was starting to say was sort of a two-part answer to you, and I lost track after the first one. You shut off your inner critic. And I think as a nonfiction writer, I've had to shut off the inner critic for film, television, other actors' performances. Actors and writers are my peers. They're my colleagues. And as an actor and a writer, I shouldn't be pointing my finger and saying, that's wrong, don't do that. It doesn't mean I don't have strong opinions. I think all creative artists have very strong opinions. That's what makes them want to get out there and put their vision out there. So I sort of have, for a long time, I was more opinionated and willing to tell people about it when I was a neophyte writer. But I realized that sort of my role as an entertainer is not to tell people, and there's a thing now on the internet, people want to tell people what you can and can't like. Oh, you can't like that. That person is politically incorrect, or we're canceling that person, this, that, and the other. Let people like what they want to like. The marketplace will, even things out. If someone does something really bad in their personal life, their sales are going to drop off. They're going to feel it in the pocketbook. Just let it come naturally. I, as an artist, shouldn't be trying to tell other people who are consuming the art what they feel about my colleagues. That's not my role. And it's the same thing with film. I think I said earlier, I enjoy them for what they are. You know, I can't go into a Johnny Weissmuller Tarzan movie expecting to see Edgar Rice Burroughs Tarzan on the screen. Now, if I were a child in the 1930s, I might go into that movie and be very disappointed. And I'm sure there was a lot of that. But, you know, the benefit of us at this time is we have a century or more of film and TV behind us. And we're discovering things. When we discovered things from the 1940s, 50s, 60s, it's already come and gone in the marketplace. We're enjoying it for what it brings to us. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I sort of just put my inner critic aside, enjoy the art for what it is, what was the writer trying to accomplish. And if I don't like it, I shut it off or I find something else, you know. But, you know, there are a couple of Tarzan movies I probably, you know, don't revisit as often. And that was more not necessarily because the actor, but just because, you know, things in the production. Sometimes you can have a great concept in Hollywood and it just loses the way in production, you know, production hell or what have you. And you think, oh, why, you know, they were so close, or why couldn't they? This is a slam dunk concept. How could they fumble it so badly? And it can be anything from the marketing department, you know, as we saw with the John Carter movie. You know, there are a variety of things that went wrong with that film. I went in, I think, to John Carter. We'll use a more contemporary example. And I had read about the production. And I thought that would follow Burroughs a little more closely than it did. So my initial reaction to that was a little bit of disappointment. But, you know, as I thought through, okay, you know, and that's another thing, is if you don't like something about a film and you understand the way they're structured, the way they're put together, think about it, what would you do differently? Well, a lot of times it's hard to answer that question because, well, given the choices they had and given the parameters they were working under, a lot of times some of these choices are baked in. Creative choices are baked in, whether it's how they're trying to position the film in the marketplace or what have you. So when you start trying to second guess it, I think that's a lot of times when you realize, maybe I should give the filmmakers a break. It wasn't my cup of tea, but I'm not going to slag on them for what they failed to accomplish, because maybe it wasn't the actor's fault. Maybe it wasn't the writer's fault. Maybe it wasn't the director's fault. Maybe it was a producer's fault. You know, you hear all kind of horror stories in Hollywood about things that producers imposed on films that just shot it in the foot, destroyed it, or a studio executive. So I tend to give fellow creatives the benefit of the doubt, I think, more so than a consumer who hasn't worked as an actor and a writer and so forth. I think I try to be more forgiving, as I said, and maybe, you know, it's not my cup of tea and I'm not going to revisit it. But I'm at the same time, you know, not going to unleash my ire on these people for putting this thing out in the marketplace that I didn't like.
So
Awesome.
Scott, where could folks get their hands on the book or get in touch with you or whatnot?
Well, Facebook is my primary social media platform. That works well for me. I am on Instagram, but not as often. You know, I'm not a daily presence on Instagram. I'm pretty much on Facebook most days. So send me a friend request or follow and like. Both of the books have a page and the magazine has a page. The books, Tarzan the Centennial Celebration, is sold out. You can get it. It sold out several years ago and has not gone into a second printing yet. Hopefully in the future it will. Because, you know, the thing about all my books is I write them as evergreens so that they will always stay fresh and relevant. And if there are more Tarzan movies, they can be added to the back, or more Tarzan books or whatever. But the content within it is fresh and remains fresh. It doesn't get stale for new consumers 10, 20 years down the road. You know, I want to write something that people can look at, you know, generations from now and say, oh, this is good stuff about, you know, that book. So Centennial Celebration is sold out, but Tarzan on Film is available at Barnes & Noble online, Amazon.com, all the usual outlets. I can personally sign or inscribe a copy if someone wants to contact me. The magazine is only available through me. So like I said, hit me up on Facebook if you're interested in the magazine, and people can message me or whatever to get copies of the magazine. We'll say one thing about the magazine is a lot of people don't realize how prolific Edgar Rice Burroughs was. He wrote about 80 novels, and he was one of the best-selling authors of the 20th century. And of course, folks in the know, people who are into the sci-fi fantasy genre, know that he was, the grandfather of American science fiction. A lot of our, Star Wars, Flash Gordon, Avatar, all of these movies mined his concepts. And that was one knock that a lot of young people got when they saw John Carter is, oh, we've seen this before. Oh, this is a takeoff on Star Wars. Well, no, George Lucas, found that in Edgar Rice Burroughs' writings and brought it to you before Edgar Rice Burroughs made it to the screen. But so with my magazine, I try to focus on different elements. The first one was very Tarzan focused because Tarzan is what he's known for. The second magazine, Burroughs wrote 4 Western novels, some of his finest writing, including 2 about the Apache Wars. From the Apache perspective, he was one of the first people to write a fictitious Western from the Indians' perspective of the whites' war against them. And he was in the 7th Cavalry in 1896. It was about a decade after the Apache Wars ended, but he was among the same people there in the Arizona Territory who had fought Geronimo. So he had a hands-on knowledge of what this was, and he was very sympathetic to the Apache and thought they got a bad deal. So he wrote 2 novels about it, and I discussed some of his nonfiction sources for this in Reverberate number 2. Reverberate number 3 is about his prehistoric tales. He was fascinated with prehistoric life and loved to drop Tarzan or his other heroes down into prehistoric lands where they could battle dinosaurs and saber-toothed tigers. It kind of upped the stakes for Tarzan to fight a saber-toothed tiger instead of just an ordinary old African lion. So the third one is devoted to prehistoric tales. So each sort of have a theme for each issue.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, sir. It was wonderful having you. Anything else you want to publish real quick or talk about before we wrap up?
I think that's it. I just want to express my gratitude for you guys having me on. If you need any images, I can certainly provide those, or you can pull them offline of the magazine or the books. And thank you very much for your time. I enjoyed it. You guys, I like it because I will say this was one of the better interviews. And
thank you so much.
The way you guys approach the material, I really like it. And
thank you.
This was very, very interesting approach, and you asked me some questions that challenged me and made me think, and I like that.
Good. I'm very glad. Well, thanks everybody. Have a great day. See ya.